it'll collapse. But it takes the information from the nucleus of the cell, the DNA, makes a copy of it, then comes out of the nucleus and then goes on ahead, process it, and then goes on ahead to continue to spread out the information to create, who you will become. Because everything that you are is locked within that DNA. Everything. So you have the combination of your parents coming together and creating this new DNA. Everything we're talking about, from everything, from all time, from both of your creations, is locked in there. And we know when the person is born, they have different traits from different parents, or they can have traits from their uncle. You can do stuff your uncle used to do, your grandma used to do. You can look like your grandma, look like your uncle. I look more like my uncle. I don't even look like my dad that much. I can see my dad a little bit. I look like my uncle. I had to ask my mom at some point, like, yeah, you sure it's something that you don't want to tell me? Like, it's weird when you understand how complex it is, but it gets you into their whole understanding and realization that this is something that is complex. I went through all of this with DNA. We can go into a lot deeper, but I don't like getting into all this information because it gets confusion after a while. But I went into this information so you can understand how complex it is. So you take this information and think about how the RNA goes in there and basically takes the genetic code to continue to process, to begin to make up the rest of you. Because remember, once that melanin explosion happened and, conception is done and over with, and, a child is going to be born, it's not completely intact. That's something we'll touch on later. But you have to understand that it's a lot of work that happens from that point. And it's a lot that is done. And the fact that this is seemingly this automatic process that's in our DNA, that once it's there and the process starts to happen, you have at work energy creating us, energy creating animals, energy creating planets, all these elements unraveling from energy because of consciousness. This is something that has to be consciously thought of in order for it to happen. And this is really deep that we're going to touch into, because you have to really think about what I just said. This is something that consciously had to be thought of, in order to bring this stuff into existence. By no means could this be an accident when you think about that type of complexity. Perfect analogy. Putting Legos into a trash can, throw it up in the air. If a human being comes down, I'm wrong. So now, when you look at all of the metals and non-metals that we are made up of, I talked about before how we have iron and copper and manganese and zinc, iodine, all these metals within us. You also find these metals within the planet itself. So when I talked about before how our planet was created as a result of a supernova. So you have to understand the last element to be produced before a supernova happens, before that major explosion happens, the last element to be produced is iron. Iron is produced. So you have the majority of the core of the earth is formed by iron. And we find it everywhere. We find all these elements throughout the planet. And I talked about Dr. Manhattan from the movie The Watchmen, from the comic book, I should say, Watchmen. Now, Mr. Manhattan, Dr. Manhattan, basically, he had his body, he had his flesh basically destroyed. He was converted into pure energy. And because he knew, he understood how the body is constructed, he was able to pull himself together. But he was first, basically converted into energy. Energy is seen and unseen. We'll talk about that a little bit here. And this is something the ancient Egyptians talked about. But he was converted into pure energy. Because he had this knowledge, he could pull himself, back together. Now, the symbol that he took, that he put on his forehead, is a symbol of the hydrogen atom. And that's amazing that he took that symbol, but it's trying to tell you something that he took, the hydrogen atom. Now, I talked about this before in a previous DVD about how when you look at the periodic tables, All the periodic tables of elements, all the elements contain hydrogen atoms. They are basically hydrogen atoms, different amounts of hydrogen atoms. When I say hydrogen atoms, I'm talking about atoms. The same thing I said before about how atoms make up all these elements is the same. Hydrogen atoms. So he took the symbol of the hydrogen atom, which we can go back and look at that symbol in ancient times. It also can represent the sun. It also can represent Saturn. So everything that they're trying to show you in that movie, The Watchmen, which we'll talk about a little bit more in this video because it has a lot in it. Everything they're trying to show you in that movie, in The Watchmen, about Dr. Manhattan, they are expressing what we are in essence and what we could do if we control our energy and consciousness, which would be in essence controlling our hydrogen atoms and being able to do some amazing stuff. You've seen what he can do in that movie, and you have to think about that. Again, this is stuff that seems far-fetched and far off, but when you understand what we're talking about and how real this stuff is and how these people know, how they make experiments and how they do things to basically manipulate these atoms to do outrageous, crazy stuff, you can begin to think of the possibilities that, we can come up with just understanding at the basic level. We are energy, we are consciousness, but the fact that in our DNA carries the genetic code for who and what we are. And by accessing that, we can basically recreate ourselves, cloning as such. We can basically heal ourselves and do amazing things by understanding how to access that DNA. Now imagine if you can access that DNA consciously, and consciously control what happens as far as your RNA going into that cell and pulling out that information, then what you can do with that information. Think about then breaking that down on an energetic level and doing something else with it. So when you go back to the movie, he made multiples of himself. I mean, this is basically what it's talking about. This is something that is like possible. I know it sounds crazy, but it's possible if you think about what you can do, if you control this stuff. It's just possible. And when they get into the X-Men and when they get into all these Marvel superheroes, especially the ones that have to deal with elements, this is what they're talking about. Because this is stuff that just can't be ignored. This is stuff that's possible. And if you get into the physical world, the physics world, I should say, this whole scientific world, and you really start studying, it's almost scary. Because then you think about, what can these people do? What have they discovered? What have they created? They have to have some amazing stuff by now, knowing what they know, for hundreds of years. These are things we got to take into consideration. So we have to understand that they are telling us that our solar system, the planets, are a result of an accident, of a big bang. So we got to go deeper into that whole thing and understand the process of a supernova and what happens and why it happens and is it supposed to happen. This is something that they don't really touch on too much. They give us the process and what happened, what causes a star to explode, but we can't look at that and just say it's a coincidence. There has to be more deeper reasoning behind that. So they tell us that, Earth is unique, that there is nothing like Earth. It's unique. If it was 1 degree higher or lower, everybody would be dead. No life could survive on this place. But you have to look at that and understand that they're telling us that because they want us to think that this, Earth is a coincidence, that it just came up out of nowhere. It's a coincidence that we are here and everything here is a coincidence. It's by chance. And this is something that when you understand how complex things are, you simply can't accept, being an intelligent person. But you also have to look at the fact that one, the moon perfectly aligns with the sun to give us, the eclipse. Can't be a coincidence. You have to look at the fact that one, if Jupiter wasn't in the position that it's in right now, basically blocking the asteroid belt, we'd probably been, wiped out a long time ago by, meteors or comets or asteroids or what have you. But Jupiter blocks all of that traffic for us. So we can't think about planets, we can't think about atoms and think about this stuff as being an accident. It's deeper. So, this is where it gets really deep, it gets really crazy when you start thinking in along the lines of a lot of different subjects, a lot of different things. So it gets deep. Now, as I said, consciousness needs existence. Consciousness needs something to perceive in order to expand, plain and simple. Now, you can't have nothing, absolutely nothing, and try to expand consciousness, because consciousness has nothing to perceive in order to grow. Now, again, as I said, when consciousness became aware of itself being something, it can move. Existence being something, it can move, it can begin to grow. This is like going really, really deep into it when you really think about it. The beginning, consciousness, becoming aware, consciousness perceiving itself. So without perception, there is no reality. There is nothing that can happen. You need something to perceive. You need to be able to perceive. So you have to think about it. You can't just, if you never learned Chinese, you can't just all of a sudden wake up and start speaking Chinese. It had to be something there, some kind of class you took, something for you to just all of a sudden start speaking Chinese. There was a man that woke up and could speak Spanish. A lot of y'all probably seen that story. But then when you follow his genetic code, his DNA, it goes back that far. So Spanish is just built into his DNA a long time ago. Whatever happened to him, it got decoded and he can speak it. This is something that I heard about before, that when you tap into those genetic codes, you should be able to basically replicate what your ancestors did. This is what it goes into in Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed, remember, they're using the Animus, the machine. I touched on this before in the Morris DVD, to basically go back into this person's DNA where all of the information that everybody in his line, his entire line, has basically done something. All that information is within his DNA. And they're using the machine called the Animus to basically tap into all of that and go back and see what he did and formalize what his ancestors did. That's amazing. Again, they give it to you in movies what's possible, what they can do. But think about that when you look at it on a sense of DNA and the sense of cells and electrons and atoms and what we know our DNA contains as far as information. If it's talking about, generation to generation, we know we can find it in DNA. So we have to look at this type of stuff. But for most of us, you can't just, teach your son about trigonometry if you never learned it yourself. You will be clueless. All of us remember being a kid, being in elementary school, being in the classroom, and then your teacher goes to the chalkboard and she write this crazy division problem on the chalkboard or this crazy math problem on the chalkboard, and you're looking at it like, oh my God, what is this? Chalkboard might as well be blank because you have no clue what it is or how to solve it. So over time, as you are taught, as you learn, you begin to understand how to do the math problem. You begin to learn how to solve it. And, you study. And what do people tell you when you study? Concentrate, focus. But in essence, what are you really doing as it pertains to school, as it pertains to learning? What are you doing? You are memorizing. You're memorizing. You're not learning anything new. You're memorizing what has already existed. So the formula, the process, the steps of solving math problems has already been thought of. It has already been thought of. It has already been done and put out there. All you have to do is memorize it. You have to memorize it. Once you memorize the process, memorize the steps and the rules, you can go ahead and do the problem. Now, as a result of you memorizing these steps, you can solve the problem. You can now do math. You are now smarter, as we would say. So we go ahead and we look at the process of school, the process of schooling, the process of education. And it's not so much learning, it's memorizing. All of this stuff existed already. You are memorizing what has already been solved. We get textbooks in school. When you get a history book, history has happened already. You are memorizing the events that took place.